you would go ahead and open up your Bibles to the book of Matthew, and we'll be beginning there in just a moment. It's good to see each one with us this morning, and I hope that everyone, as they are traveling, are able to stay safe and able to enjoy time with family as we have opportunity during this holiday season. But obviously, I hope that we're all able to maintain our thoughts about God and His supremacy in our lives. And that's some of what I'd like to talk about this morning. I've talked in other lessons about Jesus as King. And I think that idea of king is, the word king is in danger of becoming yet another one of those words that is only used in religious contexts. We don't have kings. Almost nowhere in the world that of any import are there kings. And where there are kings or queens, they are reduced to basically mascots for those countries. But those countries are generally run by some sort of democratic rule. Now, occasionally we find dictators and so forth, but even then, we don't call them kings. We call them the most derogatory thing we can, despots and dictators and so forth. But the idea of a king in any sort of positive sense is out of our vocabulary altogether. And so the only way that we think of kings in a positive sense is from a biblical standpoint. Now, I would say even as we are looking back over history, we don't have in our minds a positive view of kingship, of monarchy. We have grown up and been taught that essentially monarchy is an outdated form of government. We grew out of it and we progressed to the much more, obviously more effective system of government we're under now, which is doing so well, isn't it? We've come so far. I've been trying to go back and read things by people who actually thought monarchy was a good thing, even on the human plane. And most people did for most of history. Now, they thought that just like we do, that there are abuses, there are bad kings and so forth, but they thought as a system of government, it wasn't any worse than maybe what we're under now. And in fact, one of the books that I'm reading is by a guy a libertarian, in the year 2000, who is making the case that democracy is actually worse than monarchy. Now, you might think that's very odd, sort of an argument to make. I don't think it's as odd as it used to be. Because I think at this point, we're looking around going, maybe democracy didn't deliver all the things it promised. And so from that standpoint, just trying to reassert the vocabulary of king in some positive light and then comparing that to Jesus, I think is helpful. Just like when God calls himself Father, he means for you to have a good image of a father in your mind. And then, of course, he's a better image than that. When Jesus says he's king, he doesn't just mean for you to have the worst tyrants in your mind and go, oh, but he's a good kind of king. He means for you to have an image of king in your mind that, yes, while there may be abuses, there are valuable things to having a king. I think of a passage like the very last verses of the book of Judges, that everyone did what was right in his heart. There was no king. Like those two things go hand in hand. No king is not a good thing. And so we want a king. But ultimately what Jesus is telling us is he is the best king. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18 will come to later in the lesson, but it tells us there the extent of Jesus' authority, which is really going to be a focus of our lesson. And that is that it is all authority. He tells us there that all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And we'll think about the import of those words as we go on a little bit farther. I want to start with some questions about authority. If we're thinking about a king, we're thinking about someone who says, I am your king. What sort of questions does that pose? Does that sort of drum up in people's minds? And I think the first question that anybody would ask if somebody came along and said, I'm now the king, who gave you the right to be king? And it's a completely legitimate question, right? We wouldn't just say, oh, well, if you say so. And so how does someone get to a place where he is able to assert over really any numerous group of people that he's able to say, I have the right to rule over you? And those people basically go, okay. Like even that concept is foreign to our minds. Like, one person saying, I am the king over everyone. As a people, that's almost in our cultural DNA, that we're like, no, not without our consent, not without our vote. You don't have any rights. But most of history, if you think back, most of history has been made up of peoples who are ruled by essentially a single person who claims the right to rule over, and generally that's been accepted by most people. And so how do you get there, though? Well, I want to suggest to you, first of all, that most kings have made some claim of divine right. Now, the divine right of kings is a technical term. If you look it up on Wikipedia, it's going to tell you that it was an idea that developed in the Middle Ages. And yes, like the terminology, divine right of kings, may have developed then. But the notion that God gave me the right to rule over you is certainly older than the Middle Ages. That notion that I am here by God's will and by God's authority, most kings have claimed that. So, for instance, Saul claimed that. And Saul was right. David claimed that. And David was right to claim that. And in fact, as you go through the kingdom, and especially the southern kingdom, but even in the northern kingdom, there are right claims that God put these people in the positions that they are in. Even Jeroboam could claim, look, God put me here. God sent a prophecy to Jeroboam to say, I'm going to put you in this position. And even after he got in that position, he made further promises to him. And so there is even some legitimacy when some kings have said, God put me into this place. And I even think as you look on later, as you do look in the Middle Ages, as you look in Western history, that men who basically appealed to, for instance, Romans chapter 13 and said, God is the one who's put governance in place. And so I have the right to rule in this way because God has given kings such rights. So in that sense, they were claiming a divine right. Well, Jesus certainly makes that claim of himself, right? In Luke chapter 1 and verse 32, as Jesus' birth is being prophesied here, Luke is telling us in hindsight about these things. He says, he will be great and will be called Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. Now here are two claims. He is being called Son of the Most High, that's that divine authority, and he is appealing back to the sort of genetic inheritance, that sort of succession to the throne, that he goes back to David. He's taking up the throne of his father David. He's fulfilling that promise, even that very specific promise that was given to David regarding his throne. But Jesus goes further than this. And he does what a lot of pagan kings did, which is not only claim the divine right like God gave me the authority, but like Pharaoh, many pagan kings rose up and essentially said, I am God. Not just I have authority from God, but I am God. Pharaoh made himself that way. Eventually the Caesars made themselves that way. But of course, Jesus makes that claim as well. And it does have a great deal of impact. And in so much as people believe that, certainly that's going to impact their willingness to follow that king. Over in Colossians chapter 1, in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 15, it says there, who, speaking of Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. Now, here it is talking about him in relationship not only to the church, but his authority in the church comes from his even greater authority over all creation. So he's not just a king over the people who are willing to submit. He's king over everyone, whether or not they submit. And so it's very emphatic. And many places would emphasize the level of Jesus' authority. Now, when people make these sorts of claims, when somebody says, who gives you the right? And then somebody says, well, I have been selected by God. They have to back that up in some way. Now, they may back it up with made-up stories. The Caesars certainly would do that, and Pharaoh would do that with mythology that would back up the notion that they are God and that they've been chosen by God. They might do it with some a little bit of shifty theology, like the kings in the Middle Ages and so forth. But I'll tell you what they also would do is bring along the army that would help you be convinced that they were chosen by God. Right? Military force at the end of the day is going to help make the case that I am chosen by God. Are you sure about that? Here's a sword pointed at you. Well, fair enough. You make a good argument. And so people would submit both because of the claim, but also because of the power. What Jesus did is not only assert these things, but he asserted them with the proof. That is, he showed the power to back up the claims through miracles and through his teaching, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But he showed how far and how ultimate his power was. One of the things about kings that we sometimes think that kings, there were no checks and balances to kings throughout the ages. It's not so. There are multiple occasions where a king thought his power was unlimited, but at the end of the day, when the people decided enough is enough, he found out how very limited it was, and either was deposed or even beheaded and taken out of the way. So the people ultimately had power to push back and say, your power only goes so far. And we'll talk about the extent of authority a little bit more in a moment. But here's Jesus, and he has asserted his power in so many ways in miracles and so forth. But when we come to the cross, we have the ultimate display of power, and the ultimate display that everyone else is powerless in the face of his real, true power and authority. Who gives you the right? You have no grounds to do anything about it. And so we connect the cross, for instance, to Psalm chapter 2, where he says, why do the nations rage? And the question, it's sort of an incredulous question. What do you think you're doing? What can you do? The reality, when a king says, I'm king whether you like it or not, I can go eventually find more armies than you have and do something about it. Jesus says, bring all of your armies, bring the most powerful army in all the world, kill me, and you still will do nothing. In fact, you will have given me victory. In the very moment that you thought you were displaying power over me, you were losing. And so that's, when you step into the face of a king like that and say, who gives you the right? What are you even asking? It's not even a conversation. There is no argument here. It's not like a king who has to come in and make convincing arguments. It just is. He is the king because he has all the power. He has all the authority. He spoke you into existence. And he can, with a thought, take you out of existence. This is unquestionable authority. Well, with all of that authority, there is the next question of, okay, you are in charge, but why should we listen to you? Why should we hear what you have to say? Now, again, most kings would appeal in some way. First of all, you listen to me or else. That argument applies to Jesus. Absolutely, listen to him or else. But even though he obviously can make that argument and rest on that argument, He does not. He goes on to try to convince you to willingly listen to him, not just through coercion, but through being convinced that it is best for you to listen to him. Most kings make some sort of claim to wisdom, to superior wisdom. Some kings have claimed that because they say that they've been divinely bestowed wisdom. Some kings claim that because they say basically through good breeding, which is kind of hilarious in some cases, but they say through good breeding, they're aristocracy, therefore they're just wiser. Other kings might make some more reasonable argument and say, look, I've been trained from the very earliest days to be a king. I've studied rulership and governance and so forth. And so I've been brought up to hold this role. And of course, Solomon justly made the claim, or justly had the claim, that he was the wisest man on the face of the earth. Most kings who make the claim of superior wisdom, all kings, in fact, who make the claims of superior wisdom, are making a claim that has severe limitations at best. Right? Even if truly they are wiser than a great many men, they're still a man, and they're still going to make a lot of mistakes. Even Solomon, who really could say I'm the wisest man who ever lived, made a mess of things in the end. Even doing things as well as wisdom could avail him. But when Christ makes that claim, he makes that claim with no limitations. His wisdom is not even paralleled to the point of Solomon's wisdom. He says in Matthew chapter 12, and in verse 42, the queen of the south, he says, will rise up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Behold, something greater than Solomon is here. Here is a pagan who came across all of this territory to come because she heard something about the wisdom. And when she got there, her testimony was, it is even greater than what I thought. The half was not even told. And what Jesus is saying is her being impressed by Solomon is going to judge you, these people who've not traveled great distances. Here, Jesus has come right into their midst, and they are not impressed a whit at the one who put Solomon in the shade. And so what he's saying is, as impressed as you ought to be, and as she was with Solomon, you ought to be standing dumbfounded in awe at the wisdom of Christ. And indeed, in some sense they were, but unwillingly. In Matthew chapter 22, we have the instance of Jesus, his debate regarding the resurrection with the Sadducees. And then that's followed up by the Pharisees, who thought maybe they could try their hand next. And it says in verse 46, the conclusion of all this, it says, no one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on ask him another question. He did put them to silence. Even then, they didn't think, we are fools in his sight. What a great opportunity to recognize we have no more arguments. This man is wiser than all of us. That is not the conclusion they drew. And so, as he says, they will be judged in the last day. But we, looking back and having all the hindsight, have even less excuse than the Pharisees to sit here and not recognize the truly great wisdom of Jesus. Not to see it simply, Jesus doesn't simply say to us, do what I say because I'm smarter than you. He says it in ways that come from a place of having proved himself both as wise and as caring for us, faithful to us. In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 30, of course, he calls his burden light and his yoke easy. I'm not trying to make your life harder. You know, it is like parents who are trying to convince their children, my rules are for your benefit and for your good. I don't just sit here and think, how could I make them frustrated and angry and miserable? Which I think is sometimes what we feel. And I think at some level, that's what people think about God's rules, God's instruction. It's just prudishness. No, it's wisdom. It's wisdom that would help you and it would keep you from misery. In Romans chapter 3, of course, the ultimate proof of all of this, that Jesus is wise and benevolent and faithful, is that he went to the cross for us. The proof was already there, all through God's faithfulness already displayed. But it comes to an ultimate climax at the cross. In Romans 3 and verse 25, it says, when God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. Now, I believe that faith in that place is talking about the faithfulness of God and the faithfulness of Jesus through that blood. So through his faithfulness, for a demonstration of his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God he passed over the sins previously committed, for the demonstration of his righteousness at the present time, so that it be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And so our response is faithfulness. You know, at this point, how can you question that this king has our best interest at heart? You know, at best, we look through some of our leaders going all the way back. Just go all the way back to George Washington. And even at best, there are leaders who you think did good work, did good things leading the country. And all of them, I think, have something of self-interest. Especially now, you can't get to that office without having something of self-interest, without having some sort of ego. Here is the man, the perfect man, who comes and gains nothing. He gets nothing out of our service. He gets nothing from our faithfulness. We are the only beneficiaries in this relationship. Wouldn't you long for a leader like that? Wouldn't it be great to have somebody who truly is completely disinterested and only interested in what benefits you and making your life one of joy and happiness, and of course, in this case, for all eternity? Well, the next question people want to know is, how far does your authority go? Now, they want to know that in geographical terms, and a lot of times that's what led to wars, right? What exactly are you in charge of? And so sometimes that's what would be disputed. But people also want to know is, how much control do you demand of our lives? One of the things that you find is that especially as kingdoms grew on occasion into vast empires, is that the farther you were away from the source of power, the less authority was actually exercised over your life often. And in fact, that's particularly the case when maybe the most effective empires were empires that came in and said, essentially, you can keep living your lives. We're going to establish some law and order, and we're going to demand some loyalty in the form of taxes and so forth. But basically, we're going to leave your government structures in place, and so it's just kind of a distant authority that's being exercised. Life didn't change much for the average Joe when somebody came along and took over the worker in the field. Man, it's the same as it ever was, right? Just change the name at the header. That's not what Jesus is saying. He is saying, I have authority over everything, right down to your very breath. Now, that rankles most people, because what we want is, what we feel best, as one author put it, that government governs best, which governs least. Now, I don't so much agree with that as I used to, but I do understand it. That essentially what we want most from government, just stay out of my business. Just let me do what I want to do, which is fine so long as what you want to do is serve God. The problem comes when you don't. And then I hope the government does something about that person. But what God says is, I want control over everything. You see, what he wants is you to be his slave. Not just a citizen off in distant lands that I have only the most tenuous relationship with, but somebody who consults me for your every whim, as it were. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18, as we read earlier, all authority. What are the boundaries of your authority? There's nothing you see. There's nothing that you have even heard of that Jesus doesn't have authority over. Not here in the tangible plane, not even outside the tangible plane. If it exists, Jesus has authority over it. That's how far his authority extends. And it extends right down to you. Over in Matthew chapter 8, there's another element to this expansiveness of Jesus' authority. It is not just, wow, he's in control of everything. You just better do what he says. But in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 9, we have the story of the centurion who sends messengers to Jesus to heal his servant. And the message from the centurion in verse 9 is, I also am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to this man, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled, and he said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. Now, I want you to think, and we have thought about this passage in other lessons, but I want you to think about that. Here's a man who just comes from a military perspective and says, I understand what it means for someone to give orders and for those orders to be followed. And Jesus goes, he gets it. Now, at first blush, that just doesn't seem like that just encapsulates the gospel, does it? But I think when you take not only what this man says, but how he applies it to Jesus. He says, I believe that you have the kind of authority over everything that I only have over my servants. Yes, I can tell my servants to do things. You can tell diseases to do things. Nobody has that kind of authority, but Jesus does. And so what Jesus says is, that guy gets it. He understands that my commands are not just to people, though they certainly are that, but that I command, as we see right here in this text, I command the very weather, and it listens to me. And so here's a man who understands the extent of Jesus' authority, and so he humbly and faithfully approaches the king and requests that authority be exercised on his behalf. Now, what some people take from that, some people take from a miracle like this, is, Jesus is always going to be available to do miracles just like he did in Matthew chapter 8. But one of the problems with the way miracles, or one of the maybe dangers for us with the way we read miracles as they're presented in the scriptures, they're clustered together. So in Matthew chapter 8 and chapter 9 we looked at recently, here are all these miracles told that Jesus did, and then we say, well, look at all these miracles he's doing. Yes, but these were not common things. Miracles have never been common things. If they were, we wouldn't call them miraculous, would we? They wouldn't have called them miraculous. They'd be like, oh, here's another guy doing, the thing that we see all the time. Miracles were the sort of things that come in and say, who could possibly do this? And they're rare. They're rare even in Bible times. They're the sorts of things that when they come, untold and unheard of things are happening at that moment. And so Jesus is not saying in Matthew chapter 8, or Matthew is not telling us in Matthew chapter 8, that here is what's about to become normal, but here's a promise. So one of the things that people do with kings is they come and they want the kings to solve the problems. And that hasn't changed in democracy. People always want the government, the guy in charge, to solve the problems, to solve all the problems, even the ones that are laughably outside of your control. You remember on the occasion of Naaman when he sent word to the king of Israel and said, I've heard that there's somebody there that can heal leprosy. And the king is like, what is happening? I have no authority over leprosy. You're asking me to help with it. And he's worried that he's going to be in trouble because he can't provide the solution. There's no problem. What's happening here is a promise is being made that says, there's no problem that I can't fix. I may not fix it now. And indeed, he didn't fix all those problems here. This miracle is not representative of what Jesus did for every single citizen. It was occasional. And it was enough that people could know that at the end of the day, when everyone kneels before the king, that all those who have knelt loyalty and named his name will receive what's promised here. The authority of Jesus fully enacted over everything. He has not fully enacted it yet. It's there, he has it, but it's not fully in place. It's promised though. And so when you think of the boundarylessness of Jesus' authority, that it's over everything, it's not just, well, you better do what he says. It's what a blessing that there are no limits to his authority. Well, that brings us then to the question of submission. How do we submit to this great authority? I think, and briefly, just three things. I think, first of all, it means recognizing that right to total authority. It means recognizing that it's there whether you like it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not, or whether anybody else acknowledges it or not. Somehow, I think as we moved into democracy and we push further and further towards this idea of separation of church and state, and I do think there's some value to some distinctions, but I think we've gotten so far down that road that like we almost have the notion that the government rules over these things and Christ rules over this thing. No, Christ is over all of it. Right? And whether our leaders recognize that or not is irrelevant to the reality. He is over all of it. And so part of our submission to his authority is just recognizing that. As Philippians chapter 2 and verses 9 and 10, 9 through 11 tells us, every knee will bow. God has put him there. It's the reality. And it's not some sort of like different kind of reality. You know, like 2 + 2 = 4 is a certain kind of reality. And this is some other kind of like less definite truth. No, this is more definite. At least as definite, and I think in some ways even more and more distinctly true than even those kinds of realities. We need to understand this is total truth here, that Jesus has the right to rule. And then secondly, it means trusting in that wisdom and benevolence. Trusting that he is good and will do good to us and for us. Over in Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5 and verse 4. This is just very simple illustration of this principle. Here is the story of the first disciples being called, and it tells us that when he had finished speaking, Jesus, that is, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered and said, "Master, we labored all night and caught nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." Here is a guy who's basically saying, that doesn't make sense, but if you say to do it, I trust you enough to do it. That's the kind of trust we're talking about. Jesus gives us the kind generosity of explaining what he wants from us. But if you are left at the end of the day looking and going, I still don't understand why he wants this, you put the net out anyway. Because that's Jesus. And not just that he's in charge, but I know he knows more than I do. And I know that he knows what's good for me better than I know what's good for me. That's what Peter knew here. Peter knew that Peter's a fisherman. This is his job. So how could a carpenter know more than me about fishing? Because he's not just a carpenter. That's the king right there. And he knows more than all of us put together. So you put the net out. That's the kind of trust that he's demanding. And then finally, it's not just going along, but it is rejoicing at the extent of his authority. Rejoicing that he has this much, because I know those things about his wisdom and benevolence. I know that if I follow him, that will be best. Jesus says this in John chapter 4 and verse 34. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. This is in response to that confusion where they are talking about who brought lunch and who didn't bring lunch. And Jesus tells them he has food. What is he talking about? I'll tell you. I live to please him. That idea of, I'm so glad he's in charge. Not just, I'm glad he's in charge and not our president. Or if you take it back to the time this is right, I'm glad he's in charge and not Caesar. I'm glad he's in charge and not me. Because ultimately, that's what the cry of democracy is I know better than the government. And when you start talking about governments historically, that's not it's a low bar to say I know better than the government. Fair enough. But you don't know better than Jesus. And you never will. And it's a delight to be able to say, I am not left to my own foolish recklessness that would have more than once left me dead in a ditch if Jesus had not been there. What a wondrous thing to submit to his authority. So Jesus doesn't just say, come or else. Come, because over here is freedom. Freedom that comes in the form of slavery, a willing slavery that says that master will make me free from all the things I actually want to be free from. And enslaved, as Paul would write as he fleshes that out in Romans 6, enslaved to the things that you say you actually want to be enslaved to. If there's anybody here who needs to submit willingly and joyfully to that authority, we'd welcome you. We'd help you in any way that we can if you would come forward while we stand and while we sing.